The horses of the 2015 Kentucky Derby. Where are they now? Let's find out. Finishing 18th and last was Upstart. After the Derby, he finished 3rd in the Haskell Invitational Stakes and 4th in the Traverse. He won the Grade 3 Razorback Handicap in his 4-year-old debut and ran 3rd in the Met Mile and the Whitney Stakes before hanging it up with $1.7 million in the bank. Upstart retired to Airdrie Stud in Midway, Kentucky for the 2017 breeding season, and he's been nice. He's the sire of Grade 1 winner Zandon, who finished 3rd in last year's Kentucky Derby. Last year, a 2.5% share in Upstart sold at auction for $450,000. He's got a bright future ahead of him at stud. Finishing 17th was Tencinder. He only ran twice after the Derby, finishing 2nd by a nose in the Ohio Derby to finish up his 3-year-old season. Then he ran once at 4, 2nd again at Saratoga in an allowance race. Things have been quiet for Tencinder since then. He stands at Mill Creek Farm in his native New York, where his owner and breeder, Philip Bursch, has bred most of the handful of babies he has on the ground. I visited Tencinder last year, and he's out there living the good life. Not getting many mares, but he's still a happy guy. Finishing at 16th was War Story. This gelding ended up running for 7 seasons, and he did a little bit of everything over that span of time. After years of knocking on the door, he finally won his first graded stakes race at age 5 when he took the Grade 2 Brooklyn Handicap. He was usually overmatched when he knocked heads with the very best of his division, but War Story was one of his generation's great check getters. And when he retired in 2020 after 40 starts, he'd banked over $3.2 million. Nowadays, War Story can be found at Old Friends in Georgetown, Kentucky, where he was pensioned in the months following his retirement from the track. Finishing at 15th was Far Right. After being one of the top horses on the Arkansas path to the Kentucky Derby, he never really found that level again after his trip to Churchill Downs. He ran 15 times after the Kentucky Derby, and he won just once, taking an allowance-optional claiming race at Oaklawn Park in February of his 4-year-old season. The thing was, as long as you kept him out of stakes company, he was usually pretty competitive. He ran an optional claiming company 8 times after the Derby, and he won or hit the board in 7 of them. That kept him on the track until the spring of his 6-year-old season, retiring at the end of the 2018 Oaklawn Park meet with earnings just over $750,000. After that, he retired to be the resident at the Kentucky Derby Museum on the Churchill Downs property, and he was rehomed through Second Stride, Kentucky, and adopted by his breeder, Madeline Brasson. You'll love to see it. In 14th place was Ocho. His connections originally had plans of trying him on the turf, and they wasted no time switching him back to that surface after the Triple Crown season. It didn't really work out for him, though. He went winless in 5 starts after the Derby, flipping back and forth between surfaces, and he retired after 1 start at age 5. Ocho entered stud in Florida to little fanfare, and he was later sold to stand in Peru. Coming in 13th was Mr. Z. After the Kentucky Derby, Mr. Z was sold privately by Zayat Stables to Calumet Farm to run in the Preakness Stakes, where he finished 5th. He came back to win a nail-biter in the Ohio Derby, and he ran 2nd in the Indiana Derby before the wheels came off his form for the season. Mr. Z never won again after the Ohio Derby, and he never hit the board again after that race in Indiana, racing through his early 5-year-old season. He retired with earnings of more than $1.1 million. Mr. Z retired to stud at Calumet Farm in 2018, and he's had a pretty quiet career there, but he has gotten a Grade 1 place runner in Eminent Victor. Finishing in 12th place was Bolo. Bolo went back to the turf after running in the Derby, and he won 2 straight editions of the Grade 2 Arcadia Stakes at Santa Anita Park before a soft tissue injury put him on the shelf for nearly 2 years. When he came back at age 6, he earned his first Grade 1 victory in the Shoemaker Mile Stakes, where he got it done at odds of 30-1. He ran until 2020 and just missed the $1 million earnings mark. Today, he's an eventing horse. Finishing 11th was Fermento. Fermento went on to finish 5th in the Belmont Stakes after his Derby try, and he stuck around for a long time after the Classic season, but he never won a stakes race, and he was often barely hitting the board in lower-level races. He spent the 2019 season racing mostly in straight claiming ranks, and after a layoff of more than a year, he made one last start at Churchill Downs in a claiming race in 2020, and he finished last of 8. He had a cup of coffee as a track pony after he retired, and then he settled into life as a pasture horse in Central Florida. I've spoken with the people that have him nowadays, and I'll have more about Fermento in the weeks to come on PollockReport.com. Finishing in 10th place was Carpe Diem. Carpe Diem never raced again after the Kentucky Derby. He was under consideration for the Belmont Stakes, but his connections decided to pass on the race to work toward a summer campaign. Plans called for him to get his next start in the Haskell, but X-rays found a knee chip, and he was retired to Windstar Farm in Versailles, Kentucky. He stood at WinStar from 2016 to 2021, and he could get you a solid runner, but he struggled to get you that next level horse. He was sold to stand in Louisiana for the 2022 breeding season, and he currently resides at Aztec Equine in Sunset, Louisiana. Finishing in 9th place was Itsunako. He got a lot of time off after the Derby, and he returned to the races on December 31st of his 3-year-old season, winning an allowance optional claimer at Gulfstream Park. He tried the top handicap races at Gulfstream over the spring, and he even moved to the turf for his final start in the Grade 1 Makers 46 Mile at Keeneland. But success eluded him, and he came out of the Makers 46 with a sesamoid fracture that ended his career. He ended up entering stud in Venezuela. In 8th place was Hige, the big winner for the most Sky Miles in this year's class. Hige stuck around to run 4th in the Belmont Stakes, and then he jet set back and forth between Dubai in the winter and spring, and in the US in the summer and fall for the next 3 years. Stateside, his biggest win came in the Grade 1 Awesome Again Stakes in 2017. In the UAE, he finished 4th or better in the Dubai World Cup 3 times, even running 2nd in 2016. Even in defeat, those are some big checks to get, and he retired at age 6 with more than $5.7 million in the bank. Even though he was a top-level dirt runner on 2 hemispheres, the US stud market wasn't that interested in his services, and he retired to stand in Argentina. He's experienced some fertility issues down there, so he doesn't have very many foals. Finishing in 7th place was Keen Ice. After finishing 7th to American Pharoah in the Kentucky Derby, 3rd to him in the Belmont, and 2nd to him in the Haskell, Keen Ice finally said enough is enough, and handed the Triple Crown winner his only defeat of his 3-year-old campaign in the Travers Stakes at odds of 16-1. American Pharoah will get the last laugh though in the Breeders' Cup Classic, where Keen Ice finished 4th. Keen Ice stuck around for 3 more seasons, ran in the Dubai World Cup a couple times, won the Grade 2 Suburban at age 5, and he finished 3rd in the 2016 Breeders' Cup Classic. He didn't win a lot, but he knew how to get a check, and he retired with earnings of $3.4 million. He retired to Calumet Farm in Lexington, Kentucky for the 2018 breeding season, and his first crop of runners included Kentucky Derby winner Rich Strike. Not a bad start at all. In 6th place was Materiality. Tragic story with this one. He ran one more time after the Derby, finishing 8th in the Belmont Stakes. He suffered a soft tissue injury that forced his retirement in August of his 3-year-old season, and it later developed into a long battle with laminitis that ended with his euthanasia the following year. He was never well enough to stand at stud after his retirement, and reports indicate that he was owned by an insurance company at the time of his death after a loss of use claim was filed. In 5th place was Danzig Moon. Another sad one here. Danzig Moon finished 6th in the Preakness Stakes, then the Ontario bred was being pointed toward the Queen's Plate up at Woodbine. Unfortunately, he suffered a fatal breakdown in the Plate Trial Stakes as a prep for that race. Finishing in 4th was Frosted. One of the all-time born at the wrong time horses, Frosted chased American Pharoah through much of his 3-year-old campaign, including a 2nd in the Belmont Stakes and a 3rd in the Travers. Once he was finally out of the Triple Crown winner's shadow though, he won the Grade 1 Pennsylvania Derby, so this was a good horse. Frosted came back at 4 to win a prep for the Dubai World Cup, and then he finished 5th in the big race. Then he returned stateside to win the Met Mile and the Whitney Stakes before getting surpassed in the battle between Arrogate and California Chrome for the Horse of the Year discussion. He retired with earnings of more than $3.9 million. Frosted retired to Darley America in Lexington, Kentucky for the 2017 breeding season, and he's been a frequent shuttle stallion to Australia over the years. He had Arctic Arrogance on this year's Kentucky Derby Trail, and Grade 2 winner Travel Column has been a nice one for him too. Finishing 3rd was Dortmund. Dortmund suffered his first career defeat to American Pharoah in the Kentucky Derby, and then he suffered his second one in the Preakness, where he ran 4th. After a long layoff, he returned to friendlier turf in Southern California to finish out his season with a couple of stakes wins. He remained a top handicap horse on the West Coast for a couple years, even if he never won again, and he retired in 2017 with $1.9 million in the bank. Dortmund entered stud in Maryland for the 2018 breeding season, but he never really caught on, and he was sold to stand in Korea in 2021. He died a year later from a twisted colon. The runner-up in the 2015 Derby was Firing Line. After a pleasant surprise in the Derby, Firing Line finished 7th in the Preakness Stakes, and then he was away from the races for over a year. He finished a non-threatening 5th in his comeback start, and he was retired to Crestwood Farm in Lexington, Kentucky for the 2017 breeding season. He's still looking for his first graded stakes winner at stud, but he can get you a nice blue-collar runner. And the winner of the 2015 Kentucky Derby was American Pharoah. We all know how this one goes. After winning the Preakness Stakes in the slop, he became the first Triple Crown winner in 37 years after winning the Belmont Stakes. Following the Triple Crown season, he was dominant once again to win the Haskell Invitational Stakes, and after a hiccup to Keen Ice in the Travers, he went out on top with an authoritative victory in the 2015 Breeders' Cup Classic, securing the Eclipse Awards for Champion 3-Year-Old Male and Horse of the Year. American Pharoah retired to Coolmore's Ashford Stud in Versailles, Kentucky after that race in a deal worth $23.5 million, and he got one of the strongest books of mares in recent memory. His first crop included Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf winner 4-wheel drive, and he's got 7 Grade 1 winners and counting from his first 3 crops. He remains a fan favorite at Ashford Stud to this day, and he occupies a spot in horse racing's Hall of Fame. For more horse racing news, visit PollockReport.com.